The original title or framework for this talk was Merton and Race, but in fact I want to go beyond race and try to gesture to some ways that Merton points us more broadly to questions of imagination and difference and how to embrace difference. If I speak a little bit more quickly, I'm going to try to be centered and open up this text, but more quickly than usual, it's because I can't wait to get to our amazing panel. And so I hope what I offer is something like a kind of a melody to extend my favorite metaphor of music from which they can riff and find common points. In remembering any great artist, prophet, mystic, or saint, there is always a risk of appropriating that person's memory in ways that diminish, smooth over, whitewash, or withdraw their prophetic sting. We prefer to remember Dr. King for his beautiful dream of a future in which American children are measured not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. We are less inclined to remember King's disturbing judgment on American society and the complacency of the church for our nation's enduring sins of economic inequality, crippling poor people of all races, and the many ways that peoples of color continue to suffer disproportionately from a deeply embedded military-industrial economy, and today we would have to add the inhumane machinery of mass incarceration in the United States. We remember King. We remember King framed by the Lincoln Memorial, not so much lying dead, framed by a cheap hotel in Memphis where he had gone to support sanitation workers seeking the basic dignities that accompany a living wage. How a culture remembers selectively, or forgets its greatest artists, cultural heroes, and prophets, reveals not a little about the depth and range of its cultural imagination and collective conscience. Of course, the same is true of the church and how we remember our most unsettling mystics, prophets, and saints. Erica Totten, a young leader in the Black Lives Matter movement in Washington, D.C., puts it this way, quote, "People forget that Jesus flipped over tables. They don't want to talk about that part. As Christians, we need to think, where would Jesus be? Her answer, he would be with the people." In a recent reflection on Thomas Merton's legacy for our times, Paul Pierson laments that Merton's writings on racism, quote, "are all too frequently skirted over, if not completely ignored." Paul is exactly right. By and large, white Catholics and Christians still seem to prefer Merton's classic writings on contemplation and are less inclined to pay attention to his public witness in the struggle for racial justice. And so here is yet another realm it seems we have yet to catch up with Thomas Merton. And by we, I mean specifically, but certainly not only, white Catholics, white Christians in America. In many respects, Thomas Merton, like Jesus of Nazareth, was with the people, and he was willing to flip over the tables in the temple. Some years ago, an elder African-American woman and former Catholic nun in my parish told me that Merton's conjectures of a guilty bystander was her Bible during the 1960s, when she was an activist for racial justice and felt alienated by her religious community. She looked in my eyes and said, "Merton got it." With pained remembrance, she said, "Merton got it when few others did." Most of us here, I expect by now, are familiar with that famous moment at the corner of 4th and Walnut, just a stone's throw from this place, in March of 1958, where Merton describes in Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, he describes it as waking from a dream of separateness. It is not hard to picture Merton standing at the busy street corner, surrounded by a sea of faces of every color. He writes, "Then it was as if suddenly I saw the secret beauty of their hearts, the depths of their hearts where neither sin nor desire nor self-knowledge can reach, the core of their identity, the person that each one is in God's eyes." If only they could see themselves as they really are. If only we could see each other that way all the time. But this cannot be seen, only believed and understood by a peculiar gift. I have no program for this seeing. It is only given. But the gate of heaven is everywhere. This passage is rightly celebrated as a moment of transformation in Merton's life, after which he would commit himself to write on the most contentious issues of the day, including the race crisis exploding in cities across the country. Fourth and Walnut gives us a powerful window into one man's change of heart, anticipating his own Catholic Church's revolutionary turning toward the world at Vatican II. Yet, as much as Fourth and Walnut reveals, it also risks hiding the darker reality of the color line in society and church. Then and now, here in Louisville and in my own deeply segregated city of Cincinnati. Merton laments, his lament, if only we could see each other this way all the time, implies precisely that we don't. A lament that still resounds today in Dr. King's observation that 11 o'clock Sunday morning is still the most racially segregated hour in America. There is another epiphany of sorts, an urban epiphany in Merton's life I'd like to consider together, somewhat less idealized than Fourth and Walnut, but no less revealing, I think. It happened in the summer of '64 when Merton boarded an airplane for New York City to meet with Zen scholar D.T. Suzuki at Columbia University, his alma mater. And flying over the city at 35,000 feet, Merton notes in his journal, I suddenly realized, after all, that I was a New Yorker, alluding back to his many years in New York City prior to going to the monastery. Arriving at Columbia, he found his way to his room in Butler Hall, overlooking the streets of Harlem. Here's the passage. He writes, the noise of traffic and the uninterrupted cries of playing children, cries of life and joy coming out of purgatory, loud and strong, the voice of a great living organism. Shots, too, and there is no rifle range. Frequent shots, at what? More frequent than in the Kentucky woods behind the Hermitage in hunting season. And drums, bongos, and the chanting of songs, and dogs barking, and traffic buses like jet planes. Above all, the morning light, then the afternoon light and the flashing windows of the big new housing developments. This passage, I think, is vintage Merton. Notice how he finds something beautiful, transcendent even, in the flashing windows of the big new housing developments. But there were gunshots, too, and then drums, bongos, and the chanting of songs. In sum, the incomparable music of Harlem. Cries of life and joy coming out of purgatory, loud and strong, the voice of a great living organism. Yet just a month later, back at the monastery, the key darkly changes. He writes, quote, Jim Forrest sent me clippings from Monday's New York Times about the big riots in Harlem last weekend. It all took place in the section immediately below Butler Hall. The police shot thousands of rounds into the air, but also quite a few people were hit, and one man on a roof was killed. In the middle of all the racket and chaos and violence, a police captain was shouting, "Go home, go home." A Negro yelled back, "We are home, baby." Suddenly, the description of Harlem as purgatory, a word that means purification, bears a much more ominous meaning. What kind of purification, Merton might ask us today, are we requiring of the nation's black and brown children, too many marked out for failure by virtue of their zip codes? For whose sins are they paying? As we build more and larger prisons, fill them with young black and Latino men, and staff them with working-class whites who desperately need the jobs. Thomas Merton wrote famously of the true self, or le point vierge, a French phrase meaning a point of nothingness, as he writes at Fourth and Walnut, and of absolute poverty, which is the pure glory of God in us. It is in everybody. As he put it at Fourth and Walnut, how do you tell people that they are shining like the sun? Yet Merton was one of the first white Catholic public intellectuals to extend this beautiful and far-reaching theological insight of biblical faith explicitly to African Americans. His friend John Howard Griffin, the author of Black Like Me, was another. Certainly both he and Griffin paid a price for their supposed betrayal of the white race. In Merton's best-known essay on race, called Letter to a White Liberal, he confronts us with a question no less resonant today than 50 years ago. He writes, quote, "How then do we treat this other Christ, this person who happens to be black?" Note the phrasing of the question. What matters first is the person, this other Christ, who happens to be black. And here perhaps is the key point. Merton was suspicious of any rhetoric that elevated ideals, principles, or social constructs, including racial ones, over persons, flesh and blood persons, who in every case we are called by Christ to love, and to love as Christ. To illustrate Merton's emphasis on the divine dignity of persons over ideals or social constructs, I want to share just one more passage, penned in the deep winter of 1965. It was Merton's 50th birthday, January 31st, 1965, in which he's describing some thoughts that came to him during meditation, which turns out to be, these thoughts that rose in his heart during meditation, turns out to be a devastating passage on racism and other forms of dehumanization that he sees poisoning the atmosphere of modern mass society. In fact, here Merton goes well beyond race to diagnose the fundamental error underlying all dangerous isms or phobias of the other: racism, classism, sexism, misogyny, clericalism, homophobia, xenophobia. Merton says all of these are the logical consequence of what he calls an essentialist style of thought. Here he's drawing some from some key feminist writers during the 1960s as well, this word essentialism. Merton is lamenting the degree to which language is used not to facilitate genuine communication or understanding, but to identify and label the other's essence, so as to manage and contain our fear of difference. He writes, "An essentialist style of thought involves finding out what a man is and then nailing him to a definition so that there can be no change. A white man is a white man, and that is it. A Negro, even though he is 3 parts white, is a Negro, with all that our rigid definition predicates of a Negro. And so the logical machine can devour him because of his essence. Do you think that in an era of existentialism, this will get better?" he asks. On the contrary, definitions, more and more schematic, are fed into computers. The machines are meditating on the most arbitrary and rudimentary of essences, punched into IBM cards and defining you and me forever without appeal. A priest, a Negro, a Jew, a socialist, etc. Whether conservative or liberal, gay or straight, white or black, Christian or Jew, Hindu or Muslim, an essentialist style of thought errs dangerously to the degree it employs language and imagery as an unyielding straitjacket, short-circuiting the imagination and nailing me and everyone like me to a definition, a tautology, an essence, so that the game is up well ahead of time. Here is the corner into which we constantly paint ourselves. When you nail somebody to a singular definition, a static essence, there can be no change. No room for dialogue, no room for encounter, no room for growth, no room for transformation, no room for freedom, no room for curiosity, no room for spontaneity, no room for discovery, no room for risk, no room for error, and above all, no room for mercy or forgiveness. In short, depending on your essence, you are either innocent or guilty, never both. There can be no room for love. I sometimes wonder, when I'm feeling discouraged about the noisy rhetoric of othering in this country, if St. Paul's sublime teachings on love have become a little too familiar to Christians for their implications to really be contemplated, much less applied and lived in every aspect of our lives. St. Paul writes, "Love is patient. Love is kind. It is not jealous. Love is not pompous. It is not inflated. It is not rude. It does not seek its own interest. It is not quick-tempered. It does not brood over injury. It does not rejoice over wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things." Now, politically speaking, such a humility would seem a recipe for disaster. Yet the deep source of all such humility as we stand before the other is incarnational for the Christian, the presumption that no less than Christ, the incarnate face of God, approaches us in the other, in the stranger, and yes, even in our perceived enemy. For Christ plays in 10,000 places, and lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the feature of men's faces, writes the great poet, Jesuit poet Gerard Manley Hopkins. Or as Merton says, if we believe in the incarnation of the Son of God, there should be no one on earth in whom we are not prepared to see in mystery the face of Christ. In other words, the error of an essentialist style of thought applies to God no less than to human beings. To affix God to a one-sided image or reflection of a particular human visage or culture, white, male, heterosexual, European, yields a host of dangerous distortions in the life and pastoral practices of the church. For Christians, the Christ of our hope is not simplistically the male Jew from Nazareth whose essence we must all physically mirror or whose actions we must all robotically emulate, as if the New Testament presented such a cookie cutter model of holiness and discipleship, one size fits all. Clearly it does not. It is not Christ as essence that we worship, but Christ, the humanity of God, who hides and plays in every person's unique God-given gifts and capacity for love, to give and receive, to share in the very life of God. In conclusion, Merton remains an unsettling and dangerous thinker, both within and well beyond the Catholic tradition, and dangerous in the very best sense, I mean. Not only as a contemplative and social prophet, but also as a theologian, in his willingness over and over again to open himself completely to encounter with the other across lines of difference, to be challenged, moved, and changed by the encounter, and from there to critically question and prayerfully deepen his own traditions, prevailing assumptions, images, and language about God. For the sake of love, for the sake of growing ever deeper into the mystery of a God whose light plays in 10,000 places, Merton was willing, and so must we be willing, to be with the people and sometimes to overturn the tables in the temple. Thank you.